So let's get started. So this class, we're going to learn about the ecosystems, risk assessment, and maybe let's try to start a little bit on the hydrology, because I know that you guys did the hydrology lab. Yeah, so regarding the exam, it's going to be during the normal class time, okay? So it's 50 minutes. So it's the same as the class time, all right? So yeah, so we're going to talk about these chapters, but I think we're still having one part left regarding the mass balance and the energy balance. Okay, so we should finish that up and then quickly go over these chapters. So regarding the reading assignments, let's focus on the hydrology for these three chapters. Okay, so the chapter 7, I would say that's required for you to read. And then for chapter 5 and 6, which is about the ecosystems and risk assessment, that's optional. All right. So if we do a quick recap of our last class. So last class, we mainly learned about the mass balance. Right. So we talked about different reactors, and we also give some example problems to see how we can apply these properties into different types of the reactors. So for example, the batch reactor. So we know that the batch reactor is really happening in batches, right? So we just send in the wastewater in and then let it stir, react, right? And then discharge them. So we know that the outlet concentration is going to decrease exponentially if we assume that it's a first order reaction. And actually, for most of the reactions, we just assume it's first order. So we also learned about the Cstr. So the Cstr is everything the same with the batch reactor, except that it has an inlet and outlet for the flow to be continuous. All right, so you have inflow, outflow, and then at the same time, you have the reaction taking place. So we calculate that if we know the inlet concentration and the outlet concentration, then if we know the inlet concentration, we can calculate what is the outlet concentration, right? It's just the C in, which is inlet concentration, divided by 1 plus KT. So K is the reaction rate constant, T is the time. So further show that the time is actually calculated by the V divided by Q. V is the volume of the reactor. Okay, Q is the flow rate. So we call this time as characteristic time. And I think in water treatment, people also call this as the retention time. So they're basically the same thing if you notice any problems talking about these times. Okay, so finally about the PFR, which is a plug flow reactor, we show briefly that the concentration at the outlet is very similar to the batch reactor. It also decreases exponentially. All right. So I think in terms of deriving this process, we just quickly went over that. So maybe we can start from the PFR, right? So we mentioned that the way we derive this relationship is by assuming they're flowing in tiny slices or thin slices, right? So we're assuming that within this slice, there's no mixing along the direction, but across the flow direction, is well mixed, okay? So because of that, we can pick up a very thin slice and then just choose the location, let's say X at here and X plus delta X at here, right? And we can set up a mass balance, right? So because it's under steady state, we just have in minus out minus reactions equal to 0, right? And then further by using the property of the flow, for example, the surface area, we can derive that the concentration is going to decrease at a rate that's proportional to the concentration. This is typical first order reaction, right? So this is also the reason why we get this exponential term here. So basically the outlet concentration, C out, is equal to C in exponential minus KT, okay? So this T here, we also call it characteristic time or retention time. So it's the same as the CSTR, which is volume divided by the flow rate, Okay, so people sometimes also use the theta to represent this time. Okay, so this is actually quite interesting because when we talk about these different designs of the reactors, we first show that we started with the batch reactor. Okay, so the batch reactor is something like this. Okay, it's like just like a barrel, right? And then we mentioned that the difficulty is it doesn't have continuous flow. It's not going to handle the amount of wastewater or the continuous wastewater coming out of households or industry. So that's why we added hose or added inlet and outlet. But it turns out that the concentration at the outlet gets into something very different. We mentioned that it's converted into a linear form. Okay, so it's not the same as a batch reactor anymore. But in terms of PFR, this is something very different in terms of its geometry or in terms of its shape compared to the batch reactor. But it turns out that it has the same equation compared to the batch reactor. Okay, so the underlying reason for that is the assumption that we are assuming basically it's well mixed across the flow direction. So basically, with this assumption, you can just assume that this thin slice is just like a batch, right? You don't have mixing at the inlet and the outlet, and everything else within the thin slice is well mixed. So it is like a batch within this thin slice. So that's why it has the same reaction form or the same equation compared to the batch reactor. Okay. So now we have these two different flow reactors, the Cstr and PFR. Okay, so how do they perform? Is there a one that performs much better than the other one, or they're basically the same? Okay, so we can do a practice problem here. So for this problem, it assumes that a wastewater is being treated with a reactor that has a volume of 5,000 meters cubed, okay? So the initial concentration C0 or C in is 100 milligram per liter, and the flow rate is 1 meter cube per second, okay? So also the reaction rate constant is K equal to 2 per hour, okay? So it wants us to calculate the removal efficiency of the reactor, if it's PFR or Cstr, okay? So the removal efficiency, as we introduced before, that's C in minus C out divided by C in, right? So for this problem, it provides us with the C in already. This is the initial concentration, all right? And then basically to solve for this efficiency, we just need to find out what is the C out, okay? So if you already know the equations, right? So we can find out that basically for the PFR, right, the C out is equal to C in exponential minus KT, right? And then if it's a CSTR, right, so C out is equal to C in divided by 1 plus KT. Okay, so these are the two equations we should use to solve for the outlet concentration. Okay, so if we look at what is being provided here, so we have the C in these two equations, we have the K, right? And we just need to look for the time, right? And we also mentioned that the time, it's called characteristic time or retention time, either way you call it. So that's calculated by the volume divided by the flow rate, okay? So if we plug in the numbers here, the volume is 5,000 and the flow rate, 5,000 meters cubed. Flow rate is 1 meter cubed per second. And you can find that this is 5,000 seconds, okay? So basically we can solve for the T, and then we just need to plug in the time into these two equations. But one thing we need to first pay attention is that we need to make sure the units are conserved. So the units here, you see the K here is per hour, right? And then because of that, we also need to change the time into hours. So right now it's in seconds, okay? So what this means is that we need to first further convert this 5,000 seconds into hours, right? Just divide that by 3,600. It turns out that this is 1.4 hours. So now we can plug in these values here. So what happens here is just C in exponential minus K, that's 2, multiplied by 1.4. And here it's C in divided by 1 plus 2 multiplied by 1.4. Okay, so these are the basically the two equations which we use to solve for the outlet concentration, right? And then further in here, you see the efficiency. If you plug in this equation, actually the C in get canceled out. So that's 1 minus exponential minus 2.8. And then here is 1, let's see, okay. 1 minus 1 divided by 1 plus 2.8. Okay, so this is just plugging in the forms here, but it turns out that since here you also have the C in, right? So they can get canceled out in this equation. Okay, so what this also means is that for the Cstr and PFR, it doesn't matter what is the initial or what is the inlet concentration if you're just looking at the efficiency for the removal, right? So by plugging in these values, you can use your calculator to do this, but I'm just going to show you the final answer, okay? So the final answer is that for the PFR, the efficiency is 94%, which is really good, right? So it's very effective for removing the pollutant. But for the CSTR, the efficiency is 74%, okay? This is lower compared to the PFR. So actually you can later find out that it doesn't depend on what is the reactor geometry, right? So you see for this problem, we're using a specific value for the Q, for the V, for the rate constant, right? And basically these are the factors that can determine what is the efficiency, right? It turns out that no matter what, basically for any of these values, we're going to have a efficiency for the PFR larger than the efficiency for the CSTR. Okay, so there's a reason behind this. But we should also mention that this is specific for first order reaction. Okay, so for first order reaction, we always have the efficiency of the PFR higher than the CSTR. Okay, so here I have a quiz problem. So I give a few options here. So maybe you can take a look and choose what might be the reason for this phenomena. So please pay attention that our conclusion is for first order reaction, PFR performs better than CSTR. Okay, so I think that automatically rule out one option here. Okay, we'll just stop here. So I want to say that most of you got the correct answer. So I don't know if you guys have the experience. So basically, whenever we do the multiple choice questions, If we don't know what is the answer, we'll always choose the longest one. Okay, so here we choose the longest one. So it is indeed the longest one. Okay, so as I said, we can remove a few options, right? So we mentioned that this reaction is first order, so we should remove C. Okay, so also if you consider the CSTR, CSTR is completely mixed. Okay, so you have a tank, you have a stirrer here, and it's mixed everywhere. Okay, so and for the PFR, we mentioned that in terms of its mixing, there's no mixing along the flow direction, but there's complete mixing across the flow direction. So in terms of the mixing here, we should say that the CSTR actually mix better. Okay, it's well mixed everywhere. Okay, so then it comes to this option here. So what this option says is that the concentration in the PFR gradually decreases. Okay, so this is because for the CSTR, for this one here, we made a major assumption that the concentration within the tank is equal to the concentration at the outlet of the tank. Okay, so what this assumes is that as soon as these reactants, these pollutants get into this tank, their concentrations automatically reduced into the concentration at the outlet. So what this also means is that the reaction rate, if you remember, that's equal to K multiplied by C, right? So what this means is that as soon as these reactants or the pollutant get into the tank, their reaction rate is reduced, okay? So they're not reacting as the fastest speed, mainly because when they enter into the tank, they should use the concentration at the inlet concentration to represent what is the reaction rate, right? So what this means is that for the CSTR, the reaction rate is reduced, okay? But for the PFR, if you consider at the inlet, it's still having its highest concentration, C in, right? Instead of reducing dramatically, its concentration reduced exponentially, right? So because of that, at the initial time, you have a much higher reaction rate. But for the CSTR, it's always using a very low reaction rate, right? Let's say this is CSTR. And this is here, this is PFR. Okay, so for the CSTR, then the reaction rate is always Kc out. While for the PFR, the reaction rate is Kc, and the C here is going to decrease exponentially. So this is also the reason why we have a better efficiency for the PFR. This is because the concentration gradually decrease. You don't have this sudden decrease that reduces the reaction rate, right? So this also makes the PFR more efficient. All right. So and then you may have the question, as we said, for a lot of engineering systems, we can assume it's first order reaction, right? So why don't we just use PFR for all the water treatment facilities? Why are we still learning CSTR? Okay, so the major problem here is that if you see the CSTR is just a long tube, right? It's very challenging for us to design a water treatment system that has a very long tube in there. So we may use this tube for the transport of the water, let's say to deliver water from the water treatment plant to different households, right? But for processing these polluted water, it's going to be very challenging to do this, right? So if you just think about it, let's say for these two reactors, they have the same volume, right? And then if you want to make a PFR, so of course you need to find a, let's say a diameter, right? So let's say we use 1 meter as a diameter for this tube. You can see that basically for the length of this reactor is going to be kilometers long. It's very difficult for us to make a water treatment facility that's composed of this very long tube that acts as a reactor, right? It's very unrealistic to do that. So that's why you can later see that for a lot of these wastewater treatment plant, we use most of them are actually CSTR, okay? So this doesn't mean that PFR is not useful because we're still using these tubes to transfer water, right? So after, let's say, after we send in these water into different reactors, we're still going to use pipes to deliver them into, let's say, the next reactor or into households or into the river, right? So within this pipe, we can assume it performs like PFR, and then further try to reduce the concentration of the pollutants. Okay, so this is also the reason why people rely on CSTR more than the PFR, although the PFR is more efficient. Okay, so here I want to point out that since this chapter we learned mass balance, right? So we showed that the most basic equation for mass balance is accumulation is equal to in minus out minus reaction. So you can see that for your homework problems, we're going to use, or in the future, we're going to use this equation quite a lot. So there are some important points I want to show or want to point out. So we want to make sure that each term are actually having the same physical meaning and the same unit. Okay, so whenever you try to use this equation to solve certain engineering systems, okay. So for the reaction term, we need to check whether the sign is positive or negative. So basically, if the reactant is reducing, then we should use negative sign. But if the reactant is getting produced, okay, so we need to use the positive sign. All right. But generally for the pollutants, we're going to use a negative sign because we're treating the water quality, right? We're not producing more water pollutants into the wastewater. So we also need to be very careful with the unit conversion, right? So as you can see, there are just so many different types of units for time, for volume, for flow rate, for mass. So we should use the same unit when we're trying to plug in the equation to solve for these problems, okay? So finally, if the results do not make sense, right? For example, if you find out the concentration is higher than 100 mole per liter, so please pay attention that even for water, let's say even for pure water, the concentration is just 40 to 50 mole per liter. Okay, so there's no way a pollutant or a species that can have a concentration higher than 100 mole per liter, right? So if the concentration is too low, then they cannot make sense. So we should go back and check. Okay, so these are the general rules, key points when we're trying to solve for these mass balance problems. So finally, for this chapter, it's called materials and energy balance, right? So we spend most of the time talking about the materials balance or the mass balance. So regarding the energy balance, and there's just one simple rule that we're going to use, one simple law. It's the first law of thermodynamics. So it's basically the balance of different heat sources, okay? So the equation we're going to use is just QH equal to U2 minus U1 plus W. So here the QH is the absorbed heat, right? So let's say we choose a control volume again, right? Let's say a parcel of air, right? And then we just imagine there's a boundary surrounding this air. And then the QH is just the heat that's provided to this air parcel, right? So the W is the amount of work it does to the outside. So we know that air can expand or compress. Okay, so when it expands, it's going to do work to the outside, right? When it compress, it's going to basically the outside does work to the inside. Okay, so whenever it does work to the outside, then the W is positive. Okay, if do work to outside, W is larger than 0. Okay, so then it's a U2 and U1. So the U2 and U1 is a change of the internal energy. So they're generally a function of temperature. So let's say the U can be just a parameter multiplying temperature. Okay, so the parameter here is also called the heat capacity. Okay, so basically, if you want to simplify this equation, then you can have QH equal to C T2 minus T1 plus W. Okay, so for water treatment, normally we're not going to deal with a lot of these let's say the energy balance problems. But for air pollution control, so the temperature is going to be very important. So here, I just want to show how we can apply this first law of thermodynamics to some common phenomena we see, okay? So if you climb a mountain before, normally you can know that generally at the top of the mountain, you're going to have a lower temperature. Right? It's going to be cooler compared to the ground, okay? So I'm not sure if you have wondered what might be the reason for this lower temperature, but we can use the first law of thermodynamics to explain this, okay? So let's say this is nothing about, this is the ground, right? So let's assume that there's the air part. So we know that the temperature is caused by so within the atmosphere, especially within the layer of air that's called the boundary layer. Okay, so boundary layer is normally around, let's say 2 to 3 kilometers above the ground, okay? So within the boundary layer, the air is quite well mixed. What that means is the air can move up or it can move down quite freely, okay? So let's just choose this air parcel as an example, okay? So let's say that it moved freely from the bottom or from the ground up to the mountain, okay? So we know that the air at the top of the mountain is generally thinner, which is because of the lower pressure in there, right? So if it has a lower pressure, what we know is that the air is going to expand. So instead of having the smaller volume, now you're going to have a larger volume, okay? So if it expand, then remember for the work, it's going to be positive, right? It does work to the outside, right? And during this process, there's no heat transfer. So basically, the outside air is the same as this air parcel, right? There's no air or no heat being provided to this air parcel. So QH is equal to 0, right? So now we have C T2 minus T1 plus W is equal to 0, right? Which means that C T2 minus T1 is equal to negative W. Okay, so what this means is that the temperature at location 2, okay, the temperature at location 2 is going to be equal to, let's say, T2 minus T1. Let's do it in this way. T2 minus T1 is going to be smaller than 0 because W is positive, C is positive, right? So what this means is that T2 has to be smaller than T1. So this explains why the temperature at higher altitude is cooler. It's because the air does work to the outside, right? So, and at the same time, there's no heat absorption. But there are some exceptional scenarios. Let's say, instead of a normal mountain, let's say we have a heat source at the top of the mountain, okay? Which means that the temperature at location 2, when it becomes higher than T1, okay? So let's say we have a coal-fired power plant or like a nuclear power plant at the top of the mountain, right? So if we enforce this reverse of the temperature, what that means is that the air is not going to move freely up, okay? So the air, what happens is that air can never go over this boundary. Okay, so it can go up, go down, but never can go over this temperature boundary. Okay, so also call this temperature as the inversion, temperature inversion. Temperature inversion. So maybe putting a coal-fired power plant at the top of a mountain is it's a very unusual thing, but let's say we can also have some scenarios where the temperature at the ground is much cooler than the temperature at the top. Okay, so this generally happens at night. Okay, so whenever the sunlight is gone, right? So the region that cools the first or the quickest is the ground. Okay, so in this case, during the night, you're going to have this temperature inversion, which means that the pollutant that's emitted at night cannot move further higher up. So they're constrained at a very bottom layer of the air. So it's very inefficient for the dispersion of the air pollutant. Okay, so we can later find this out at the end of this semester or end of this class to see how the temperature affects the transport of the air pollutants. Okay, so this is about the energy balance. All right, so this also concludes our chapter 4. Okay, so the chapter 4, we learned about different types of the reactors. Right, so we first basically go over the batch reactor, and then we mentioned that we have to introduce flow into the reactors, right? So that's why we also have the we introduce the Cstr, which is giving you the flow, right? And also we have the PFR, which is more efficient in terms of the removing the pollutants. But we found out that actually Cstr is more realistic for the water treatment or the wastewater treatment. So finally, we learned about these energy balance or how to apply these for air pollution. So now let's just quickly go over chapter 5 and chapter 6 about the ecosystems and the risk analysis. So as I said, these two chapters are mainly about the concepts, right? So this is something maybe we can read after this period of time or even after this semester, right? So I'll just try to point out some important definitions. It's not long, just a few slides. Okay, so the first one is the ecosystems, right? So this chapter is called the ecosystems. So the ecosystems is short for ecological systems. Okay, so it basically, according to its definition, the ecosystem is a living system that include all different types of living organisms. Okay, so living organisms can include plants, animals, and microorganisms. Okay, so the ecosystem can be used to describe, let's say, lakes, rivers, forests, lands, constructed wetlands, or even, let's say, on top of your roof, you try to plant some food, some crops. So that's a tiny ecosystem as well, right? And so I'm sure that if you are a little bit familiar with painting, you know that this painting is called the Water Lilies. It's by Monet. And this guy painted like thousands of water lilies, right? There are actually quite a few in the St. Louis Art Museum. So these are basically one type of painting styles, right? So I think in this painting, it gives a quite good description of an ecosystem, right? So if you want to point out the components in this ecosystem, we see that there are trees, right? Tall grass surrounding this pond, right? There are water lilies. Of course, these are the subjects of this painting, right? But below the water, there are also fish, right? Microorganisms. Inside the soil, there may be some insects as well. All right. So this is a nice picture of the ecosystem. And within this ecosystem, as we said, there are different types of living organisms, and we can basically categorize them based on their way of consuming or producing the energy, right? So we know that, for example, for these grass or trees, they mainly rely on sunlight, right? So because of that, they're also called phototrophs. Okay. So basically, they're using the sunlight to generate the energy, right? So we know that let's say for the bacteria or the insects or the fish, they rely on others to generate the energy, right? So they're also called chemotrophs. Let me see the spelling. Okay, chemitroph. So this should be P here, chemotrophs, right? So within the chemotrophs, we can also divide these animals into different types. Let's say the herbivores, right? They mainly rely on the grass or the green plants. There can be carnivores. So they rely on other animals. They're fed on other animals. Okay, so I kind of feel that we human beings, have a bad perception about carnivores, right? Because normally they have very sharp claws, right? They can be dangerous to human. But it turns out that for an ecosystem, these carnivores are very important in sustaining the entire ecosystem. Okay, so a typical example that people use is about the wolves. Okay, so mainly it's about the wolves in the Yellowstone National Park. So there was a period of time in the United States where people just get rid of all the wolves, because they feel that it's too dangerous to all the animals and also to human beings, right? So it turns out that there is actually causing some ecological disasters, especially for the Yellowstone National Park. It's causing the degradation of the soil quality, the grassland, right? And I think in 1970s, they reintroduced back the wolves into the national park. And you can see how the national park get restored to its original state. So here I have a short video. It's just about 4 minutes long, so maybe we can just go over it here. Let's see.
This is our home.
One of the most exciting scientific findings of the past half-century has been the discovery of widespread trophic cascades. A trophic cascade is an ecological process which starts at the top of the food chain and tumbles all the way down to the bottom. And the classic example is what happened in the Yellowstone National Park in the United States when wolves were reintroduced in 1995. Now, we all know that wolves kill various species of animals, but perhaps we're slightly less aware that they give life to many others. Before the wolves turned up, they'd been absent for 70 years. That the numbers of deer, because there was nothing to hunt them, had built up and built up in the Yellowstone Park, and despite efforts by humans to control them, they'd managed to reduce much of the vegetation there to almost nothing. They'd just grazed it away. But as soon as the wolves arrived, even though they were few in number, they started to have the most remarkable effects. First, of course, they killed some of the deer, but that wasn't the major thing. Much more significantly, they radically changed the behavior of the deer. The deer started avoiding certain parts of the park, the places where they could be trapped most easily, particularly the valleys and the gorges. And immediately, those places started to regenerate. In some areas, the height of the trees quintupled in just 6 years. Bare valley sides quickly became forests of aspen and willow and cottonwood. And as soon as that happened, the birds started moving in. The number of songbirds, of migratory birds, started to increase greatly. The number of beavers started to increase because beavers like to eat the trees. And beavers, like wolves, are ecosystem engineers. They create niches for other species. And the dams they built in the rivers provided habitats for otters and muskrats and ducks and fish and reptiles and amphibians. The wolves killed coyotes, and as a result of that, the number of rabbits and mice began to rise, which meant more hawks, more weasels, more foxes, more badgers. Ravens and bald eagles came down to feed on the carrion that the wolves had left. Bears fed on it too, and their population began to rise as well, partly also because there were more berries growing on the regenerating shrubs. and the bears reinforce the impact of the wolves by killing some of the calves of the deer. But here's where it gets really interesting. The wolves changed the behavior of the rivers. They began to meander less. There was less erosion. The channels narrowed, more pools formed, more riffle sections, all of which were great for wildlife habitats. The rivers changed in response to the wolves. And the reason was that the regenerating forests stabilized the banks so that they collapsed less often, so that the rivers became more fixed in their course. Similarly, by driving the deer out of some places and the vegetation recovering on the valley sides, there was less soil erosion because the vegetation stabilized that as well. So the wolves, small in number, transformed not just the ecosystem of the Yellowstone National Park, this huge area of land, but also its physical geography.
So I think this is a nice video about how the introduction of a carnivore actually affects the entire ecosystem, right? So we shouldn't hold any negative, let's say, negative perception to any of the living species. Actually, they can make a huge contribution to our ecosystem, right? And then, so as we said, we can divide our ecosystem based on the way these living organisms live, right? So as we said, there can be phototrophs. Phototrophs are basically using the sunlight as their primary energy source, right? So there can be chemotrophs, which is using chemical energy that's either coming out of the sun, either coming out of the plants or the grass, or coming out of other animals, right? So we can divide them into herbivores or carnivores. So this is the way we tell the difference in animals, right? But we know that there are other things that are not animals, but also rely on these phototrophs, right? We know that there are bacteria, fungi. So they also rely on these phototrophs or rely on these chemical energies to sustain themselves. Okay, so in water treatment, actually people deal with a lot of these polluted water species with these bacteria or fungi. Okay, so it turns out that for a lot of the organic pollutants, where it's going to be very difficult for us to dissolve them, these tiny living organisms can help us dissolve them very quickly. Okay, so this involves further the differentiation in the way they respirate. Okay, so we can divide them into aerobic respiration. So aerobic respiration means that when they do this metabolism, they rely on oxygen to oxidize these organics into carbon dioxide. Okay, rely on oxygen. So there can be anoxic respiration, which means that they don't use oxygen, but instead they use the nitrate or nitrite as their oxygen. Okay, so this is for a small fraction of the bacteria. So there can also be anaerobic respiration, which means that the bacteria can only live in the environment when there's no oxygen or no nitrate present. Okay, so a typical example is a yogurt bacteria. We know that in order to create those acidic flavor, we cannot expose these yogurt bacteria under oxygen, right? Because many of these bacteria are doing the anaerobic respiration. Okay, so because of these different types of respiration, people can introduce different bacteria into the wastewater to reduce the concentration of certain organic pollutants. So for example, we can let it go over the anaerobic oxidation first to dissolve or to remove some of the organic pollutants. And then we can introduce them into a reactor that has aerobic respiration, where we introduce a lot of oxygen. Because natural water has a lot of oxygen inside. So we want to expose this water with oxygen so that we can use that as a final stage to treat our water quality. Okay. So another important concept is bioconcentration. All right. So we can go over the schematic diagram. So again, here is showing the food pyramid or the food chain. As we said, the phototrophs are at the bottom of the food pyramid, right? So further above it, it can be bacteria, it can be these herbivores or carnivores at the top of it, right? So in terms of the bioconcentration, say the bioconcentration. So it describes a process where the certain chemicals concentration becomes higher and higher as it moves up along the food chain. Okay. So for example, this is talking in organic pollutant called the polychlorinated biphenyls, PCB. So people normally just dump them into the lake water or river water. Okay. So as you can see, the first species that's getting affected are going to be these tiny bacteria, right? The phytoplanktons or the zooplanktons. So because of the concentration of these pollutants, you can see that there are some of them getting accumulated into the bacteria. And then we know that there are some fish that has to rely on these bacteria to sustain themselves, right? So for example, smelt fish, right? So they actually feed upon these planktons, right? So later people find out that the concentration of the PCB actually gets higher in the smelt. It's 1.04 ppm compared to 0.0 something ppm. This is mainly because the PCB is very stable, right? It's not going to get expelled or get removed from the organisms very quickly. So because of that, because of this accumulation, the smelt can be consumed by lake trout. So you can see that the concentration of the PCB gets further higher. And finally, for the birds that rely on these trouts, you can see that the PCB concentration in the egg becomes much surprisingly higher, right? 124 ppm, which is much higher. So you can see that this is a process showing the bioconcentration, right? So people also design a factor called the concentration factor or the bioconcentration factor. So which is basically just the concentration divided by the original concentration. Okay, so for example, if we're talking about the bioconcentration from the trout to the bird, right? So the bioconcentration factor is just 124 ppm divided by 4.83. Okay, so if you're talking about the bioconcentration from the phytoplankton to the bird, then that's going to be 124 ppm divided by 0.025 ppm. So it depends on which process you're talking about regarding this bioconcentration factor, right? So a very important concept for the ecosystem is about the different cycles, right? So they're basically it's talking about the nutrition cycles. For nutrition cycles, we're mainly interested in carbon, the phosphorus, nitrogen, and sulfur. Okay, so we're not very interested in hydrogen or oxygen because they're just anywhere, right? For the carbon dioxide, I think we introduced a little bit in our introduction class, right? So there are a lot of processes, let's say the photosynthesis, the let's say the animal respiration, or then further they can get decayed, right, and then get emitted back into the atmosphere. So there are factory plant, the power plant emissions, right? So the ocean can also uptake some of these carbon dioxide. And then these species can also turn into fossil fuels, right? So in terms of the carbon cycle or the carbon dioxide cycle, I think this is a better one to show what are the magnitudes in these, right? So you see they can get a large fraction is getting emitted from the fossil fuel. It's around 34, right? And then the ocean takes around 8.7. The land through the photosynthesis, it takes around 11.2, right? And then by burning the forest, human actually change these forests into the farmlands, right? So this also emit a fraction of the carbon dioxide. So by calculating these sinks and sources, you can see that the atmosphere actually takes a lot of these carbon dioxide over the past 10 years, okay, 2007 to 2016. So regarding the distribution of carbon dioxide from the air, atmosphere, and the ocean, if you recall the Henry's constant, so we explained why the carbon dioxide is not getting dissolved into water as efficient as the air, right? Because the carbon dioxide has a low Henry's constant, right? So that's why most of them are staying in the atmosphere. So we're going to finish up the remaining parts of the ecosystem. It's just around 4 to 5 slides and the risk assessment. So we're going to focus more on the hydrology on our Wednesday class, okay? So feel free to let me know if you have any questions, and we can maybe talk about the exam a little bit more in our next class, okay? All right, see you on Wednesday.